So, team, psychological safety. It's a topic that I guess some people might know about, some people might never have heard of the term. And I guess maybe just to set the scene and get us started, I guess I'd be interested to hear it from both of you in terms of what do you think this term is? What is psychological safety?
You want to go to, I mean, you're laughing, so that looks like enthusiasm.
Well, enthusiasm, stroke, my usual mix of everything. So, yeah, the issue is, I think there's quite a clear determination between who you ask, you're going to get a very different response. So, psychological safety's been around in the kind of L&D space for a long time. Pretty much for as long as there's been instructional design, there's been discussions around. Originally, what was it? It was it kind of evolved from learning comfort, which was the same thing, making people feel comfortable getting the wrong answer and trying again. It's been a cornerstone of teaching since, well, basically since ever. Yeah. If people don't get an answer wrong, they're never going to learn. I guess more than anything, the way when you for instance, I did my usual thing. I went, I'll ask a person smarter than me, and from a kind of psychological perspective, they kind of define it as a set of brackets where you can somewhat measure people's willingness to fail openly, and their comfort in that. Now, of course, the ability to measure it is inherently not accurate because you're just asking someone how they feel. Which is a bit challenging. But yes, really, at its very core, that's what we're looking at. From an L&D perspective, what we care about is people's willingness to basically look like a bit of a numpty by getting the wrong answer or doing something wrong and learning from it. At its most basic, anyway.
Yeah, cool. What about you, Gemma? How would you describe it? That's, one view.
It's interesting that every time we kind of get a hot topic in L&D, myself being a bit newer to the industry, I come to you, Tom 3, and you say, we just rebranded this. This is something we've been talking about for decades, but we've given it this kind of new makeover and called it something else. But I guess it's come to the fore because of the pandemic, with a lot of people, I guess, reconsidering how, like, what they need from their job. And it being more paramount than ever that they work somewhere where if they're not okay, they're comfortable to say, that it's not toxic, that they feel safe, that they feel like they can experiment, like Tom said, and kind of get things wrong, and it's not punished or negative, it's part of the learning culture. I think the data is suggesting that increasingly employees are kind of looking at their workplaces and expecting more of that personal mental health well-being support and guidance from leaders, and feeling that they're really cared about and they're valued. So it does seem to be, as much as it is kind of like the flavour of the month in a way, it does seem to be a really vital part of why people stay. And research would suggest that people that feel like they have it are more productive, motivated, innovative. Interesting if you agree with that, Tom 3, but that there's the real business benefit. So it's not just a kind of fluffy, nice to have. It's actually part of a high-performing team.
I think that's an interesting, just to focus on that point there, I think although it is something that it's not inherently new, like nothing is new at this point. There is no new when it comes to learning and instructional design. Everything, we know what we need to know, we just need to do it. And I think that's what we're seeing now more than anything, is it's always been that's a part of what we do. And it kind of got paid lip service to, or if you were really good or you had a great team around you, you would get it right. But it was the exception, not the rule. And now we are seeing that kind of, everyone is leaving our terrible company. I wonder why. And the panic that ensues, and the answer is to look at stuff like this. Because you're quite right, although it's maybe not a hard as metric as sales or customer service metrics or whatever it might be, it's a metric businesses now have to challenge themselves to get to grips with. And find a way of looking after these people and measuring whether or not they're doing a good job.
I wonder if, engagement surveys and pulse surveys, the kind of questions that companies are asking have shifted, hopefully they have, to not just be, how do you feel about your job? but how do you feel here? You know, what is your relationship like with your manager? How do those interactions feel? Are you supported? Are you, you know, invested in? Like those kind of bigger questions that are more cultural than they are just that person in silo.
Yeah, I think it's going to take businesses to be quite brave with that, because historically pulse surveys, they split opinion because there's no standardized way of doing them, right? And so I think some businesses are also more receptive to what they'll do a pulse survey, and some will go, wow, this is such important data. And equally, I've been in others where they get information and they go, oh yeah, but we'll explain this away with X, Y, and Z. Of course, everyone feels tired. It's just that time of the year. But yeah, but that doesn't make it okay. Kind of, you know. It's I think businesses are going to have to be quite brave and be willing to. We used to say arrow in, but I don't think arrows is in. Arrows is no longer in the ascendancy in the L&D
circle
world.
round.
But it's
square off.
Well, this is it. That's it. We're a different
touch
we're
base.
I know many shapes. It's expansive.
Yes.
You need to take a hexagonal approach to this. Really, is what you need. That's the key.
Dodecahedron, surely.
Classic move.
No, I'm going to stick with the original and say it needs to be arrow in before arrow out. Companies need to really consider what they're doing before they try and explain it away on being the people's problem.
But also that the data that's going to come back. So it's much easier to be like, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, you know, don't go into detail, just let us know how do you think things are going. But when you start asking these more qualitative questions, which are more personal and people can expand on, you're potentially going to get a huge wealth of data to go through. And I would imagine that the actions that drives isn't kind of necessarily going to be a simple, oh, we'll put a process in, we'll do a quick fix, but it's going to be bigger cultural coaching, or we've got some fundamental issues at management level, or people don't feel, you know, happy and healthy at work. So it's going to throw up some potentially really big shifts that are needed and questions.
I think one of them from an L&D perspective is probably going to be data skills. You know, the ability to assess Likert scale data is not particularly challenging. You know, say it's a 1 to 5, 5's good, 1's bad. Something in between is something in between. Whereas if you've got lots of qualitative data, you're going to have to do you know, you're going to have to look for thematic curves and all this kind of thing. And it's not something that I think many people in many businesses would feel comfortable doing. They'd go, can't you just give me a number? And then I'll maybe look at a few comments. Whereas I think it's a much bigger investment to actually do like a thematic survey of a business, because you're going to get everything that anyone could say, and you're going to actually have to read it and think and then put a story together. And I think that's a big step for a lot of businesses. So it'll be good if they do it.
Do you think like stakeholders as well, typically your board level, would give that kind of data less value and credibility as opposed to kind of the cold hard numbers when we start looking at, you know, thoughts and opinions and feelings that we're mining from people? Do you think that's a harder sell, that we need to do something from them?
Well, we shouldn't ever present that, in my opinion, only my opinion, but I would never present that data to them. Because again, I would never present data to anyone. Data tells us nothing. Data is a starting point. So if you've got all this thematic data, what you then do is you put that together and you say, okay, so people are saying, I don't know, what are they saying? They're saying that they love the coffee shop, but we closed it. And okay, that's interesting, but isn't really a business related thing. So no, the board probably won't care. However, this happened, and then we also took away, I'm going to use some great examples from businesses that I know upset people, that we took away the weekly fruit basket delivery, and we closed down the jacket potato stall. All these three were massive fallouts in the business. They sound silly things, but it's weird what matters to some people, right? So these three things happen. Over the 6 months after that, the question should be, what happened to our performance metrics? Did they go up or down or stay the same? Or what's that? They went down. That is what you take to the board, because that's the story. Well, as long as they do actually correlate, yeah, and not, you are looking for causation as opposed to just correlation. So you've got to do a little bit more, but you know, that's what you want to be presenting. You want to be able to tie it back to something that does matter to the board, rather than trying to persuade them that jacket potatoes are really important, because they're kind of not really, but the impact that they had clearly was.
So just to go a little bit further, because we've talked quite a bit there about the sort of the definition and almost around the outside of it. But I guess hearing from both of you, any specific examples, any anecdotes, perhaps of where you've been in a company where you've really felt that psychological safety? Because I guess it'd be interesting. We've talked a bit about maybe the broad definitions of it, but I'd be interested to know, as I guess hopefully our audience would as well, what are the true characteristics of an organisation that has that psychological safety? So yeah, either of you been in a business where either it has or hasn't been prevalent?
I have definitely, unfortunately, got.
I thought you might have, Gemma. It's not where you work currently either, is it?
No, don't know. I never talk about my previous my previous trauma bubble. Yeah, I think I've definitely worked somewhere where I guess some of the kind of trademarks of a kind of toxic culture and the impact that has on everybody has been very much felt. And I think it's stuff like not having trust, feeling like you're micromanaged and questioned and criticised to a point where, of course, you're not doing probably great work, you're not having that freedom, and you're not feeling comfortable to sort of think of new ideas or how do we do things better, or really want to get involved and collaborate. You're just surviving because you have that fear. I'll do exactly what's expected of me in this very rigid way, and I'll keep my head down because it's so unpleasant if you were to challenge or disagree, or try and have the discussion that went, that question the echo chamber or the status quo. And I think, it's incredible that it's not recognised that, one, it's a horrible way to treat people and for people to feel at your business, but two, the impact on then what the output of that is, whether it be how people are talking to your clients or the quality of the work or your growth potential. You're just quashing it because the people aren't happy, and then of course they leave. So you hemorrhage great people and kind of squander the potential for anyone that might have really been an asset and might have really given a huge amount of value. And it's just, no one wins in that scenario, I think. Tom 3, I'm hoping you don't have a similar.
Yeah, have you got a more positive or an equally negative experience?
Oh, I've got plenty of equally negative ones I could roll out. But I'll try this. And the sad fact is that there are a lot more bad examples than good examples out there of this. I think it's not even close. It's not that bad when you think about it, because even when we say this is a bad example, there is still a spectrum within every business. And I think there's a couple of things in there, I guess. So the first thing would be, I guess, I know I've worked in one business previously that was fantastic for this. And it's a slightly unusual business, very like big business but small headcount, that sort of situation. I think by the time I left, they'd just been valued at about £1 billion business, and yet still, you looked at the employment figures and you were like, this could be a medium-sized operation at most. So they'd kind of walked a very clever line, but they had done that because everyone from the person that worked a couple of hours on the weekend to a senior leader could pick up the phone and call any of the board members. Their mobile numbers were just readily available. They visited stores on a very regular basis. They regularly took employees out for dinner. Now, all of this stuff sounds like it's just a way of rewarding success or being very close to the business, but in actual fact, what it meant was you could pipe up about anything at any time. And that meant that when there was change going on in the business and you were learning, especially when you were learning, they would ask what's going on and they would expect you to call them. And they would expect feedback and invite it and encourage you that if something went wrong in your store, they wanted to know about it. They were very open about the fact of, we don't want it to go up through your management line. They wanted it to come directly to them. And I think that simple invitation makes a huge difference.
Yeah, because I suppose it's not what you're talking about there as well. It's not just doing it for the sake of it. That's real living the values there, isn't it? And there's real purpose and genuine, there's genuineness behind that activity.
Was that quite difficult, Tom, in terms of like hierarchy? So like, did middle management ever feel threatened or overlooked, like people going above their heads to escalate it to the senior team?
I know they had, in most businesses, you would say if you got to be a middle manager, you're probably settling in, right? The middle management structure at that business was very small. Very few areas of the business. You had line managers, and then you had people who managed a lot of people and the directors. They very deliberately didn't have lots of layers in there. Because they had all experienced it before, and I've experienced it, I'm sure we have at other businesses, where you tell someone that there's a problem, and they go, great, I'll elevate that. They elevate it to a middle manager who's like, well, I'm not telling anyone else there's a problem in my area of the business. No. So it dies with them. And then nothing ever, and then all the directors here is, we're living the values. It's amazing. It's just fantastic. And then everyone's shocked at the end of the year when you're getting fined, or everyone's left, or whatever it might be. So I think I'm sure probably some people did feel unhappy with it, but I don't think they then stayed in the business very long. The business, it wasn't a new thing. It had been around since the start. When you were coming into the business, that's what it was pitched as. Like a prime example of the kind of opposite is working in a business where the idea of picking up the phone to someone outside of your area of the business was a kind of, no, you do not do that. Like, you'd be very careful what you tell someone out in any other part of the business, because managers were hiding everything.
So culturally, that's one example. I guess we might have people hopefully listening to this podcast right now, or in due course. But you've just picked on one example there of maybe how, as a leader, or even just anyone within the organisation, you might start to pick up some of those signals or warning signs of what a lack of psychological safety, and in many ways a lack of culture, looks like. So, what sort of things should people look out for that might be signs of this kind of toxic sort of culture or lack of psychological safety? What should people look for? How can you health check for this kind of thing, so that you can start to maybe recognize that you've got a problem here that needs fixing?
Well, I think firstly it's looking at what training's needed, because I think there's been a lot of talk of managers need to step up, leaders need to step up, look after your people, have conversations with them, support them, do all this stuff. And sometimes we're forgetting that it needs to start at that level, as in, are they okay? Are they getting the right support? Do they have what they need? Do they feel in a kind of strong position where they can emanate the right behaviours and healthy habits and things like that? Or do we have an issue of the psychological safety of our leaders? Because it's easy just to write them off and say they're the senior team, they're fine, they've got it, and that's not always the case. And then actually enabling them to have those conversations, because obviously in an ideal world you're just sort of checking in with people and it's very light and everyone's fine, but there's going to be some difficult stuff that's going to come up. There's going to be people that are very unwell or very scared, or, like we say, burnt out, or have personal things in their life that are hugely affecting their job that they think they're going to lose and they're not coping. And as much as we're kind of well-meaning and we might think we're a great friend, being able to manage that within a work context and know where the line is, how involved to get, when to escalate it, how to make someone feel better in that scenario, that doesn't often come naturally. There needs to be boundaries in a way that company deals with that stuff. So we need to start with that learning piece and figuring out where are we and what do we want it to look like.
Agree with that. I think something I'd add is, in terms of just things to look out for, the biggest telltale sign for me is, are you or the people around you worried about what you say and to who? If you are, there's a problem. And it may be localized. Again, arrow in before arrow out. But it may be the company culture. If you join a business and you are briefed, don't speak about that to this person and be careful around that. That's a sure sign that you probably should stop your application right there and go work somewhere else. Unless you're there to rebuild the culture. Because once you get into that kind of environment where you're constantly walking on eggshells about what you say to who, because you don't want to upset such and such because they know who's he what and all this sort of thing, you will never be able to be effective in your role. I always think it's quite often we confuse things like psychological safety with not being critical of others. and it's not the same. You should, in a workplace environment where you have psychological safety, you should all be able to be critical of each other. That's kind of the whole point. Not critical in a "you're terrible, go away" kind of concept, but critical in the more traditional concept of offering feedback or flagging when you're unhappy about something or when you disagree about something, and being able to disagree with your colleagues. And that's not a problem. That's just expected. It's a good way of working. I think too often we think of it as everyone's going to be happy all the time, and that's just not. It's not good. It's not healthy. No one should be happy all the time. That's dangerous.
Yeah, there's maybe a classic example of that, Tom. I'm just thinking, I was thinking just literally, I think it was the other day when there was a course that I'd commented on and said, I think maybe we need to take another look at it. And then you sort of came to me and said, is there a problem with that course? And my initial reaction actually was just go, maybe I've trod on Tom's toes here. And then you actually just came back to me and said, no, actually, it's fine. If the course isn't right, then absolutely we should look at it. And, I just thought your response actually was that real sort of like, actually, yeah, I don't, I'm not taking it as personal or that it's a criticism of anything I've done per se, but actually just a criticism. I want the product to be better. And that felt like a very kind of open, sort of response or something that rather than just being like a, okay, yeah, actually I'm upset that you're telling that something's wrong. It was actually, no, we should definitely look at it if it's not the right product type scenario. So that's, a good example, I think, of where it's that constructive criticism, I guess, isn't it? That is how it should be taken.
Definitely, and I think there's a... Sorry, I was only going to say, I think outside of the corporate space, there's the concept of intellectual honesty, which is you think what you think until you know better. It's the willingness to say, I could be completely wrong, because I am not the arbiter of absolute fact. Here's what I think and why I think it. You give me the opposite, and let's see what happens. That should be how every single one of these conversations goes. More recently it's been called like evidence-informed learning design, but that kind of general approach, and the intellectual honesty is a broader topic, I guess, but if that were just applied to every conversation in every workplace, can you imagine how many petty disagreements or squabbles or teams that can't work effectively together or with each other, they just wouldn't exist anymore? If people were just willing to say, I disagree and this is why, what do you think of my point?
And that phrase, like, learn it alls instead of know it alls, I think is really relevant there. I mean, what you guys said about sort of feedback, I think when you said, Tom, what are the signs of, that maybe things aren't going so well, I think it's important to look at how people connect and communicate in the organisation and if there are opportunities for it. So if you're managing people, but you only check in every 6 months and it's very transactional and a kind of tick box, and you're not having those proper conversations or investing time in your relationships, then you probably don't have a clue what's going on and they're not going to feel like they can talk to you. Whereas you have something, and you have to do this really well, like real-time feedback or those kind of regular, brief, as-needed check-ins and meetings where people are collaborating across loads of different ways, then it's much easier to spot that someone's behaviour is slightly different, or their performance has dropped, or they just seem different. And you to spot the signs in someone they're not doing well, you need to know how they look when they are doing well, and to get to know them and kind of make that effort to build that safe space where they can say, this is... I think the best thing as well is where you have someone that can say, when they're at the beginning of struggling, and say, like, just to put on your radar, this has happened, or this is how I'm feeling. I'm okay, but I might need some support, rather than when they're right at the end of their tether and, you wake up and realise that this has been going on for 6 months, but it wasn't the kind of business or relationship where someone could talk to you about it. I think leavers questionnaires are probably really vital, or exit interviews, especially if you really think about the format where people will be the most comfortable to complete them, or who with, and the kind of questions that would add value, and look at, are people leaving because of people? What are the kind of trends, what's going on? Hopefully it'll be kind of a more honest forum.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a big lack of data in that area across the board. Again, part of that's consistency of data, because lots of businesses collect something but not the same thing, so it's very difficult to draw comparisons. But like, there's a lot of talk around, people don't leave businesses, they leave managers. And I agree that I've left a job for a bad manager before. I've left far more bad businesses than I have bad managers. Because, for instance, I stayed in a job probably a year longer than I wanted to because my manager was fantastic. And I felt that I would be letting them down if I left. Now, the question of whether or not that's a healthy thing in of itself is another debate. But I did not leave that job because of a manager. I left it because the business culture was appalling. And actually, the people who most... and some people will agree and disagree about this, but the people I think who actually made the culture so unpleasant were not managers, they were not leaders, they were colleagues. There were people throughout the business that had just absorbed this. I don't know. You stand in the swamp long enough, you start to stink, right?
It's a bad culture that allows bad management to thrive. It can attract. I think if it's not checked and there's a lot of problems, then it can attract and retain the kind of people that are happy doing it their own way and not having to be that corporate and getting away with, whatever they want. And that can be end up being a sort of, dumpster of a kind of bad practice and behaviours that's just tolerated.
There are entire companies that are run like this.
So I'm going to change tack for a second and take us down a different line, because I guess we talked quite a bit about leaders and managers, good, bad, and we touched a little bit, I think, on maybe needing to check in on the psychological safety of leaders first, but what do you think are some of the support or even some of the skills that leaders and managers need to be able to tackle this? Because I guess part of the complexity as well is that psychological safety can be very broad, and some people probably don't need as much support. Some people's psychological safety can drop off very quickly. So it's a complex thing. So how do we prepare people for almost this role that they're going to have to play, in a business? What are the sorts of things that can help in this scenario?
I think it was really interesting we talked a lot about empathy on the last podcast, and Catherine said something about, the kind of most competent manipulators and deceivers are really good at empathy because that's how you persuade people, by making them feel understood. Which, is a different way of looking at something that at the minute we're like, be empathetic, upskill in this area, that it can be kind of like used for good and evil, I guess, of how much you can convince someone that they are listened to. But fundamentally, that's, I think people are wanting to be heard and valued and included. And a lot of classic leadership models are, forging ahead, telling people what to do. I'm too busy. And now what we're sort of saying is some of that active listening, some of that coaching and probing questions, rather than just solving problems for people or coming up with the solution, is what people are almost expecting, and is how they feel like they belong, and then they kind of have value in an organisation.
I think it's quite... Yeah, I was reflecting on this yesterday, actually, after we recorded episode 1. And I was thinking back to the first ever management course that I attended, which I then realised was like 10 years ago, which was a bit depressing. But I remember sitting there and hearing all this stuff about how we need to listen to our people, we need to encourage them to be open and honest, and we must show empathy and all this kind of thing. And then you'd walk out of the room going, great, I now know exactly what I should do. Hang on a minute, I have no skills. I feel like so often that's what happens. For instance, we go, we are training you on psychological safety, we are training you on empathy. What we forget to do is go, we should probably equip them with some skills, some actual things they can go and do, rather than an understanding of what these things are and why they're good. And I think what the question you did there was kind of really nailed it in terms of skill set, because the skill set of managers is not really appropriate for setting culture. You look at the difference between a manager and a leader. A manager should be about numbers and performance, and really what you want is leaders. And in most businesses, you're required to be both. And I've known some fantastic managers that are appalling leaders, and vice versa. And to be honest, I think the best leaders are probably terrible managers. When you look at people they're all about the people and the culture and the vision, they're not the ones checking performance KPIs on a spreadsheet, which is what a manager needs to do. It's very difficult to go from, and our vision is to, so I need to speak to you about your 3% drop in performance over the last quarter. One person trying to do that is a big ask. And I feel like often, as an L&D function, we're guilty of it. Managers must be leaders, leaders must be managers. You also must be coaches and mentors and kind of on-the-job trainers as well. You have to do everything. Yeah, exactly. And then the business comes up with its own list that L&D didn't know about. You also need to use all this software, you need to do this. And then we wonder why kind of frontline managers are some of the highest turnover jobs in any business. It's because they're the least, they have to do more than anyone else in the business in terms of breadth of what they're asked to do. So when we look at that skill set, we've really got to try and narrow it down, effectively business by business, as to, what do your immediate people need from you? Rather than trying to say, this is what good leadership looks like globally, this is what good management looks like globally, because there needs to be a little bit of a dial up, dial down approach maybe. A line manager will probably be 85% manager, 15% leader. Then your next step up will slightly swing more and more and more, and by the time you get to your, CEO or whatever you've got leading the business, you're going to be maybe 95% leader, and they've got a CFO to look after the money stuff, so they're dealing with the spreadsheets. And so when we look at those skills, I think we have to be a little bit careful not to say these are these skills, and instead look at individual companies, individual job roles, and some skills will be common. Active listening is a prime example. But then when we look at coaching, mentoring, are those skill sets something that should be globally applied? Probably not.
I think that came out fairly clearly in our last conversation as well, didn't it, around that very point?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So I hate to be the L&D person, but you need to do a training needs analysis or a learning needs analysis. Right, it needs to be a good one. It needs to involve skill sets and action focuses and basically just doing a proper job. And I think that's what, and this is where I think L&D is most fallen down in this area, is we've kind of just done the leadership. I shall Google leadership, pick the first 5 skills that come up, and that's what we're going to focus on, rather than structuring a very nuanced, very company-specific sort of development program for managers and leaders. And company-specific doesn't mean you have to build it from scratch. Some of the best content, I think if I was going to build one today, I'd be looking at going, so identify the skills, then what have we got that address those skills? Because I don't need to create an active listening course. Active listening is a very well-defined skill. Is it company-specific? No. Are our values company-specific? Yes, that's where I focus my energy. And then maybe, whether it's curated content from online, off-the-shelf content that you have in a library, whatever it might be, you pull those individual skills into the job role, rather than saying, these are the skills that everyone needs and we're going to create all of it.
I've seen some good sort of examples. So you were sort of saying there about, it's not, if you just give someone a course, say, on this is empathy, it doesn't mean they can walk away and be an empathetic person. What I've seen that I think looks really encouraging is, one, defining what that looks like in the business. So here's some behaviours that go with that. Here are some conversations, or within the context of how we all work together, this is like a success story or a case study or some examples of what that looks like day to day. And we're going to build that into our processes here or our HR policies, and it's going to affect our recruitment in this way. So it's not just a tick box, we want to say we are empathetic as a team or a business. It's like a lived value. If it really is, like you say, after your training needs analysis, something that is lacking and is damaging, you need to address it, putting the effort in to go, how do we, beyond a course, embed this into how we work with each other, how we speak to each other, how we deal with our client relationships? Do our processes support us to be able to work like this? And then reinforcing and rewarding when it does happen, and calling it out and challenging it when something goes against that, so that you are creating that ecosystem around it.
I think it's interesting because I think I was going to say I think empathy is a particularly interesting one, because I would argue that empathy is it's not a skill or a thing in of itself. When we say, oh, that person's very empathetic, that isn't displayed by empathy. It's displayed by a whole set of skills that we group together as empathy. It's whether it's active listening, acknowledgement, whether that's clear and open, honest communication, the ability to, I don't know, it's part of relationship building. There's so many actual skills tied up within empathy, and I think that's a big part of the problem, is that so many of these things are grouped together to the point of it kind of makes sense to group them, but I don't understand what you actually want. Like every business I've worked in has defined empathy wildly differently. And I mean wildly.
Which I think is okay as long as it's clearly defined and it's meaningful to that business, right? So that people aren't just like, you know, what in this instance, like, what does it mean? Is it changing? Are we just picking up a buzzword here? But concrete examples of this is how this value comes to life, and this is what it means for us. And like you said, this breaks down into these skills, these behaviors. This is how it connects to things, so that it can be seen, and like almost the intangible made tangible sort of thing.
100%. You've got to drill down to that next level. That's the big thing, is get past the big words and get to the detailed skills stuff.
Cool. All right. So I've got two more questions that I'd like to kind of just cover off as we go through this session. So I guess I wonder if the world we find ourselves in now, with hybrid and remote and flexible and all this stuff, what complexity does that add on top of psychological safety and how you have those conversations? You know, that I guess in reality it maybe makes it harder, or at least it could be more sensitive because you're potentially, dropping into people's homes, and therefore having to try and have those conversations when they might be feeling maybe even more vulnerable. How do you create those same connections? So I guess it's quite a tough one, but what's your thoughts around psychological safety in today's world?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, there's no one thing that's going to be true here, because I totally get why the initial assumption would be it's more difficult, but then some industries I think have probably found it to be an absolute godsend. I know a lot of people who work in software, they've loved it. Like their working practices have become better, their working relationships better, because they just tend to get on each other's nerves sat in an office. There's always, because for a lot of people, there's always been an underlying, there is no benefit to me being sat here versus at home. And that has been an underlying bubbling frustration for the last, ever since the internet got good, really. As soon as the internet made it to fibre, everyone was going, why am I here? That it just doesn't make any sense. And now that I think it's actually a huge opportunity to redress that, for many people, resentment within the workplace. And it isn't just the Silicon Valley fancy trendy businesses that can do this stuff. But I think it does come with a different set of challenges. But I think most of them really relate to expectation setting and your initial onboarding. If you get that right, you set everything up. The issue we've had is that, of course, we didn't switch to working from home. Everyone just went home. Businesses didn't do this, and if a business was going to implement a change like that, it would take them 6 months to a year probably to get the infrastructure, the skill set, the right people, all that stuff. Instead, literally overnight, in many cases, we went, go home. Do you have a computer and the internet, by the way? It's not quite the same thing.
I would have enjoyed that if that was Tom one morning. Go home. Goodbye.
Just get out of the office. But I mean, literally, that's what happened to lots of businesses here in Swindon. People showed up that day and they were just like, yep, you need to go home. And so I think moving forwards, we'll see businesses that did that still struggle, because many of them still have chosen not to really make the necessary changes. But I think businesses that proactively say, we're going to have a hybrid, work from home, flexible, remote, whatever they choose to do with their people and their business, because they're going to choose to do it and implement it properly, hopefully, I don't think they'll see those same challenges. But I think the biggest thing is onboarding and expectation setting. If you get that right, the rest of it is not that insurmountable.
No, I think we talked about this a little bit on our sort of hybrid working podcast, but I think there can be some kind of I guess, unexpected pitfalls, especially if, say, you're a manager or a leader and suddenly you've got half your team that are coming in with you that you see every day, that you work with every day, and half of your team that are now remote, working on some of that unconscious bias or that inclination to reward more the people you can see. Because I think there's research that suggests that even if two people produce the same piece of work, if you witnessed one of them doing it, you're more likely to think that that took more effort and that's a better job. And it's like kind of out of sight, out of mind when it comes to promotion and checking in with people. You know, if it's natural, if you're running into each other, if they're in front of you and you're having those day-to-day conversations, it can be easy to not put as much effort into the relationships or the team members, you know, that you're not with. So it's thinking about what are the other opportunities, be it tech, you know, phone calls, what are the preferences of that person, how do we collaborate in our organisation, where you're having those, I guess, like simulated water cooler moments and making sure that you're not treating people differently because of where they are. You know, it's that equal sort of playing field, and that you're, I guess, aware of that, you reflect on that, you check in, is it working, how are people feeling, you're bold enough to ask the questions, you know, like we were talking about going back to these pulse surveys, engagement surveys, or just one-to-one. Is this working for you? Do you feel supported? Are we talking enough? Do we need to talk more? Am I asking the right questions? And not being afraid to sort of get that feedback and sort of temperature check the job that you're doing.
And I think you touched on it there. So the final question, I think, is, you touched on tech. So, I mean, I guess in this space, technology, is it a saviour or is it a hindrance? What do we reckon?
I think technology's got very little to do with it, to be honest. It's people. All technology is potentially great, potentially disastrous. You know, Skynet was a great idea till it wasn't. It's yeah, you see it a lot. He says, "Oh, email culture is terrible." No, email is a really effective way of getting information from one place to another. If you misuse it, then your people culture is terrible. I think actually there's a lot of time spent on which platform is the best for collaboration. Any platform that allows one person to speak to another person is fine for collaboration. I think it's the people. It's all about the people. Because if you stripped all of it away, you could pick up the phone. Or you could, you know, depending on where they are, you could meet up and have a conversation. I think technology is often used as an excuse of, oh, the technology isn't good enough, or whatever it might be, or I don't know the technology well enough, or it's people. It's the same as it's always been. We managed perfectly fine when managers had people in different offices within one building. We managed when they had multiple buildings and different campuses of businesses. This is just an extension of that. And so I'd actually argue the technology has very little to do with it. It's the people's use of technology that matters.
I think it's mindful, especially if you're a company that's shifted and you're using a lot more tech. When we've talked about this before, like things like, do people have to have their cameras on? How many meetings are people having? Are they going to get fatigued by that? You know, how do you run a digital meeting and encourage collaboration and creativity to simulate the good stuff that happen in the office? And like being aware of how people are feeling, what that's doing to their working day. You know, if you've got so many platforms that it's overcomplicating things or, you know, tiring people out, and just being conscious about how communication has changed and how teams gathering has changed, I think would be one from me to sort of to look at.
Good. Okay. So I'm going to round the session out, but I guess like we did on our last one, any final thoughts from each of us around sort of psychological safety, top tips, something you want people just to really walk away with? Where would you want people to end this session with? If either of you would like to go first.
I think from, I guess, my main thing of kind of what I've been talking about with clients and heard about is ask. I think that's like the first port of call is, what avenues do you have to find out from people as honestly as possible what their lived experience is of working in your business? And you have to do it in a way where you might get stuff coming up that you don't want to hear. You might be a leadership team that's decided to find out, and what you find out is people aren't happy with the leadership team. So I think it's being prepared that there is work to do and things to improve and people that won't be happy, and actually wanting to dedicate the time to change that, recognising the benefit to the business.
I think, again, as the last one, I'll come at it from an L&D perspective specifically, but I would say, embrace that kind of intellectual honesty I was talking about, that evidence-informed process. Assume you are wrong. That should be your default position in everything you do. Assume you are wrong until proven otherwise, because often you will be, and that's great. And then tell that to your learners. That they will be wrong most of the time, and that's a fantastic position to be in. Because if you're right most of the time, you're wasting your time wherever you are. You need to move on and try something else. It's the single biggest change we could make as a function. We could make it as a world, that would be fantastic, but that's probably beyond the scope of this podcast.
For sure.
But just within your L&D
Global
team,
change.
embrace that idea.
Global change.
That's it.
Yes.
One episode at a time.
No, that's good. And I suppose, on just to run off, from my own perspective, because I also think you're totally right there, Tom. I suppose also with a lot of this, when you assume you're wrong, or even just to start from that position, or even to say, hey, I'm wrong. Actually, my little boy, he was fighting over a toy earlier today, and I said, is that yours? And he realised that it was his sister's, and he hadn't got his out of his bag, and he said, oh, actually, I got it wrong. And that requires vulnerability. And I think, but that's a key component here, I think, in a lot of this is, as a leader, it can often feel like, particularly if you're not feeling great, or you're feeling a little bit vulnerable, or you kind of even maybe step into that space around psychological safety, that can feel vulnerable. But actually, a leader who inspires, and to be an inspiring leader, I think takes you to take that risk, to maybe own your own mistakes, to say that you're wrong, to show up, be seen, those kinds of things. And I think that's a big part of this. And it takes someone brave to maybe step into that vulnerable space, but others will admire and appreciate that, I think, particularly in this sort of psychological safety space. All right, well, thank you, Gemma and Tom. Really insightful conversation. So our next session is all around personal anecdotes, I think, isn't it? And getting personal. So that will be interesting. So just really sharing more of our own experiences around this, and we'll be joined by another fantastic guest who will be joining us on that session. So we will call it a day there, and thanks very much for listening.